All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another ASP.NET Core Community Stand-Up, where we discuss the latest updates and developments for web development with .NET and ASP.NET Core. I'm Daniel Roth. I'm the product manager for ASP.NET Core on the .NET team, and I'm joined today by Artak. Artak, do you want to say hello?
Hi everyone, I'm Artak, an engineer on the ASP.NET Core team.
Awesome. Welcome, Artak. It's great to have you. Yeah, so today we are going to be talking all about, let me get the banner going. There we go. Automated browser testing with ASP.NET Core in .NET 10. We're going to show some of the improvements that we've made for doing integration testing with the latest .NET 10 bits. Now, I thought I would do a little bit of an intro here about testing with ASP.NET Core. I mean, testing is, of course, a critical part of the software development process, and testing web apps can be a little bit challenging sometimes because of the many different components and technologies involved. Fortunately, ASP.NET Core has a bunch of features and tools that we can use to help us do that. Let me go ahead and bring up my screen here so that we can look at a few of those features. Let's do my screen. Okay, there we go. So if you go to the ASP.NET docs, I don't know if you guys know this link. Docs.asp.net is a nice little short. There, I misspelled it. Docs.asp.net. It's a nice little link just to get to the ASP.NET Core docs. If you go to the docs and you scroll down here, you'll see there's actually a whole section on testing and debugging and troubleshooting. And if we click on one of these links, this will take us into the ASP.NET Core documentation with all of the content that we have related to doing testing for web apps with .NET, with ASP.NET Core. Now, obviously, there's a bunch of different ways to test your application. Like if we look through some of these, there's the standard unit testing, where you're going to take small isolated pieces of your app and test those just by themselves, and that's a great way to quickly test components and to catch those bugs before they get introduced into your code base. But there's a lot of other types of testing as well. There's load testing and stress testing. You can test your Blazor components. You can do performance testing. But today, what we're going to focus on is integration testing. Integration tests, where you want to take all those different pieces of your app and see, well, do they actually work together? They seem to work in isolation, but do they work as a full and coherent system? Okay, so that's what we're going to take a look at. Now, in ASP.NET Core, we have a couple of framework features already that help you do integration style testing. The first one I want to call out, like if we scroll down here, there's a nice little introduction to integration testing in this article. If we scroll down, there's this component right here called test server. That is, it's a low-level component. This isn't something maybe that you interact with on a daily basis. But what test server does is it allows you to take an ASP.NET Core app and send requests to it all in memory. So you can exercise the middleware pipeline of that app and just see how things are working without having to introduce the network into the mix. And I'll show you that real quick. So here I've got Visual Studio open. And I have a couple of tests that I've been messing around with setting up. And in this test, what I'm using is that test server component. Now, in order to use this, by the way, you need to install a package. If we go look at my package dependencies, we can see that I've got this Microsoft ASP.NET Core test host package. Okay, so that package will give you access to test server. And then what we can do is here I'm just creating a web application, create builder, and then use test server. That's the API that will then, instead of using Kestrel, which is what you would normally use for running an ASP.NET Core app, we're going to use that test server, which will now handle all requests in memory. And then I'm setting up a simple endpoint, a minimal API that I can call, and getting that app started. And by starting it, we're not actually starting Kestrel. We're just sort of allowing it to now receive requests. And then what you can do is you can use test server to get a test client. And that test client is actually just a normal HTTP client. You see that? So you get a full HTTP client. And that HTTP client is kind of like wired into the ASP.NET Core app, right? Like you can send requests with it, and it will just pipe directly into the ASP.NET Core middleware pipeline without dealing with the network. So you're doing everything fully in memory. We can actually send our get a sync request to the root of the app. We're just doing some simple validations to check that, did we get a 200 OK response? And then checking that the response actually is the hello world string that I sent. Okay, so if we go over to the test explorer, you can see I ran these earlier, so they're working fine. But let's run our test server test to see if we can run our little in-memory test. And yeah, so one test completed, one passed, 0 failed. So that looks good. Okay, so that's test server. It's a pretty lightweight but fairly low-level component for exercising the middleware pipeline in ASP.NETCore. Like I said, you don't usually deal with it directly. There are a couple cases where it might be useful. Like if we go back to the docs, there's actually this separate topic down here about testing middleware that goes into quite a bit more detail about using test server to, like, if you have like a custom middleware in your app that you want to exercise by sending requests through it, you could use test server to do that. And this shows you how you could do, if you have like my middleware, how you could exercise that with this component. But normally you won't do that because there's a bunch of concerns that test server just doesn't handle. Like if you actually want to test your app, like you've written an application, test server doesn't make it particularly easy to like get into that app. And like if you want to customize the services and the middleware that are part of that app because you need to adjust things for your test environment, test server is not great for that scenario. But that's why we also have a different component in ASP.NETCore, which is this web application.
Dan, I think you went to a muted state.
Weird. I don't know how that happened. I must have hit like the magic keystroke in StreamYard to mute myself. Well, anyway, so web application factory is basically like a wrapper around test server that will set up the test server, but also it will set up the test server with an existing ASP.NETCore app. So you can like change the services, customize things for your testing environment. So that's usually what you end up using when you want to do like in-memory style integration tests with ASP.NETCore. And you can look through this doc to see how to use that, but I'll show you a quick couple examples. So besides this like test server test, I also have this web application factory test. Now, in order to use web application factory, again, you have to install another package. You're going to want to install this Microsoft ASP.NETCore MVC testing package. That's where the web application factory lives. It is in an MVC package. As far as I know, Artak, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think it has any MVC dependencies. Does it actually depend on anything in MVC?
I don't really. I think it is mostly due to historical reasons.
It's great that, yeah. Where the MVC team, we built this back in the day when we were trying to help people test MVC apps. Of course, now we have Blazor and other technologies, but still lives in that namespace. But it doesn't actually depend on MVC as far as I know. But here's an example of using Web Application Factory. You can see that you can just new one up and you point it at your like program class, like the sort of the thing that's setting up your application, and that will go in and figure out how your app is actually being set up. You'll basically kind of attach that Web Application Factory to your application. How it does that is kind of like black magic. I was actually talking with David Fowler last night. David Fowler's an architect on the ASP.NETCore team, about how does it get its hands in. Like here's I have my web application. It's got a program CS file and it's using top level statements. Like there's no, first of all, there's no program class that's actually visible in here. You might be wondering, like, where's the program class come from? With top level statements, the class actually gets generated for you by the system, so you don't see it here. In the past, actually, that was a little bit of a problem because the program class was generated as internal. So pointing to it like this from your test project, where here I'm referencing that program class, was actually not immediately possible. So there was a workaround that people often did where they would define like a public partial class program, I think is what they would do, to just have the program class be public so you could actually refer to it. Fortunately, in .NET 10, that's now fixed. You don't need to do that anymore. So you can get rid of that code if you have that in your app. Sometimes people would actually make their app like internals visible too, like to their test project, which is kind of nasty, right? You're exposing all your innards to your test project. I know sometimes that's needed, but not a great solution. In 10, you can just point to the program class and it will work. To get access to all this code, though, there's like all sorts of fun stuff that ASP.NETCore does. Like we wire up a diagnostic source and listen to an event, and then the web application APIs will actually like raise an event, make the object available so that we can pick it out with the web application factory. It's a pretty complicated setup. There's some nice blog posts out there that you can go read up on how that actually works. But trust us that under the hood, it will figure it out. So once you've got that set up, you can then, just like with test server, create a client. This is again creating an HP client. You can see that there, right? HP client being returned, and then you can make requests, and that will now make requests to your actual web app. And here the web app's pretty, like you saw, it was bare bones. It's just like a minimal API that's returning hello world again, but that does now work. So if we run this test, back to Test Explorer, run this guy, we should be able to test our actual endpoint code from our separate ASP.NETCore project. And give that a minute. Yep. Okay. That passes just fine. Now, obviously, that's a very like a trivial case. What if you want to test a more like fully featured app, like a web app, like a Razor Pages app, or MVC app, or even a Blazor app? I have another example here that I pulled out of the. This is actually from the ASP.NETCore docs sample repo, where we have a much more elaborate Razor Pages project. I'll run it just so you can see what it does. Let me get that running. This has got a database and a bunch of UI. Where is it going to pop up? Over here, my other screen. There we go. Okay, so this app's got, it's got a little message text box thing where you can say whatever you want here, like hello, ASP.NETCore Standup. And then we add that message, and that gets added to the list. And then we can analyze the messages for like their average word length. Here's, I guess it's 6.25 words. You can delete messages. There's a bunch of other pages like the about and privacy page that just have static content. We've got this GitHub profile page, which I think uses like it interacts with GitHub to like get information about a particular user. So if I put like my profile username in here, it should grab there grabs my name, what company I work at, so a bunch of stuff, right? And so testing this, there's a bunch of things going on. You could of course do unit testing to test your Razor Pages individually and their functionality. But if you want to do an integration test to test the system end to end, including like database interactions and so forth, we're going to need to use something like the Web Application Factory to do this. So I'm going to head and close this, and because we don't actually need the app running, because we're going to do it all in memory. And let's look at how we can do a test for this. Here's a basic test for my Razor Pages app. Up above, we're setting up a test fixture using Web Application Factory, again, pointing to the program class. Test fixture is just like some common like setup code that we want for every test that runs in this class. And then we're grabbing that Web Application Factory. And then just like before, we're making that call to create client to get an HTTP client that we can then use to issue requests to the web application. And here we're just like testing all the pages and making sure that they return successful status codes like 200 OK, and that the content type of the return responses is in fact HTML. So very basic integration test here. Of course, you might want to like take that the Web Application Factory and do something more elaborate with it. Like you might want to customize it to like change the services that are being used. And this app does that. Like if we look at this other test, like here's this index page test. And here, instead of using Web Application Factory directly, we're using this custom Web Application Factory. And if we just like go to the definition for that, that is a derived class from Web Application Factory, but we're overriding some methods that then give us access to like, the service collection. So we can change the services that are actually in the app. Like here, I think if we went through this, it's going through and like basically pulling out the DB context that it's using and substituting in one that uses, I think, SQLite. So, whatever you want to do in here, like if you want to adjust the services to make it work in your test environment, you can now do that with Web Application Factory. And then if we go look at the tests, some interesting things here. It's using that custom Web Application Factory. It's creating the client again, doing things like, turning off auto redirects so you can see every request along the path. Here we're doing some test requests to actually send post requests to the service. And this is where things start to get, kind of complicated, right? With integration testing. Well, first of all, we're dealing with integration testing of a web app. You're dealing with a whole bunch of HTML. like in that first test we saw, we weren't doing anything really intelligent. We were just checking like 200 okay, great. Is it HTML? Great. We assume it's otherwise fine. But if you actually wanted to check the content of that HTML, well, now you're talking about like, parsing that content somehow. There are options for doing that. Like this app, sample app actually uses a library called Angle Sharp, which is a community library, which is great for like parsing HTML, and you can write validation logic based off of that. So that's certainly an approach. Then when you want to like, if you want to post requests to your web application, you have to worry about things like, well, auth cookies and anti-forgery tokens that might be, in the form that you're trying to, send a post request for. They become a bunch of complex things you have to deal with. This sample tries to handle that with a whole bunch of HTTP client helper methods, like extension methods that it's defined, using Angle Sharp to grab chunks of HTML to produce the right things and send the right tokens. But sometimes you might be like, you know what? Why don't we just use the browser? Let's just use the browser to send the request. A lot of the things that we, in this world where we're just dealing with HTTP client, we can't assume they just work and we have to manually handle them. If we just use an automated browser test, the browser would just deal with that, and we could, maybe have an easier time. I mean, there's other complexities with having having to start up a whole browser, but in some cases where things get really complicated in your integration test, that might actually be preferred. And so that's one of the things that actually Artak has been working on. It's like, how can we make it easier to do automated browser tests with ASP.NETCore apps? Where you could leverage a lot of this cool infrastructure that you get from like WebApplicationFactory for like customizing the services and so forth. But with a browser, you don't want it to be in memory, or at least you generally can't have it be in memory because the browser expects there to be an actual endpoint there. So how do you have the browser talk to your test service? And so Artak, do you want to tell us a little bit about that and what you've been working on? Actually, let me
Sure. Thank you, Dan. Yes.
Questions that we've got in the chat. Is this part about UI testing? Yes, we're going to be talking about UI testing today. And yeah, there was definitely some dark magic in how WebApplicationFactory works underneath the covers. Okay, looks like we're good, Artak. So why don't you go ahead?
Sounds great. Thank you, Dan. So that was great. Let me pull up my VS instance, and we'll talk a little bit about the recent changes made to the WebApplicationFactory to make all the problems easier to deal with, problems that Dan mentioned associated with in-memory test server. So where to start? Let's start from the following. I have a Razor. My screen is shared, right? I have a Razor web application, the default one. I haven't changed much except a tiny little bit of data injected into the privacy page. Okay, so you can see my program CS file, and it was generated as is. I haven't changed anything here except this bit. So I registered an iData service instance of or type implementation of real data service, and that's it, right? And then in my privacy page, I render some data coming from model, and in my privacy page model, I have a data service injected through constructor here, and the data that I've been rendering on the page is basically going to be coming from the service. Okay, so let me just run this app so you can see what it looks like. And again, it's just it's going to be very simple privacy page rendering.
But with a service that you're depending on, that you might need to deal with.
Code. Here it is. So this is the default app. I go to privacy page, and important privacy information was that data. Okay, cool. So now, oh, by the way, going back to your point regarding the program CS file, program class being internal, I missed that bit. That is amazing, because I had to do the very same trick of internals visible too.
New improvement in 10. You don't need to do that anymore.
I thought I'm doing that, and I probably did that in the Blazor app. Anyway, that was cool. So going back to how we test this now. Okay, let's close this page. This page. Actually, let's close on. So I have this test project. And in my project, as you can see, I'm going to utilize Microsoft Playwright XUnit package. So Playwright is a automation library, basically. It allows automating against browser and testing too. It's cross-platform. It has support for many languages, including .NET, which is great. And I have to mention this, it is from Microsoft. Anyway, so today I'm going to utilize Playwright to demonstrate some of this automated testing stuff. So let's go to the privacy page test, and I'm not going to focus on the Playwright itself. I'm simply going to use it as a tool to demonstrate the WebApplicationFactory improvements we've made. So as you can see, I'm in my test, I'm newing up a WebApplicationFactory implementation, and I'll go into this in a bit. These two lines are new, like these two APIs weren't there before .NET 10. I'll talk about them in a bit, but if you think what happens next is I'm just getting the URL of the privacy page, I'm navigating to it, and as you can see, my test class there derived from page test. This comes from the Playwright library, okay, and it gives us access to, for example, to this page property, and it allows now to interact with the browser or with a page through the browser. Okay, so now I'm using this page property to navigate to that privacy page link I built here, getting all the content back from the response, and then validating that my page has appropriate title, for example, and that the test data I injected into the page is there. Well, you may ask, like, what is test data? We've never talked about test data. And that's where this Razor Web Factory comes into play. So I then have shown another example of this, where we have a custom factory implementation, which is derived from Web Application Factory of the program file, program type, and then configure web host is the API where we're going to customize all the services. And what I'm doing here is I'm replacing my data service implementation with test data service implementation. And my test data service implementation returns test information instead of, as you may remember earlier, the important privacy information text we injected earlier. Okay. So now let's just see what the page looks like only with this service change. Okay. And for that, I'm not going to debug. What I'm going to do is introduce a delay here for 10 seconds, let's say. So while this test is running, I can open a browser and we actually can see the real page started through this Web Application Factory.
Because when you run the test with Playwright, like it's I assume it's like in like a headless type of, like, is the browser even visible when it's like doing the test, or is it kind of like
so Playwright supports both. I'm going with whatever the default is. I haven't customized that part. Again, this particular talk is not about Playwright at all. And I'm just going to open a new browser instance on the side and show you that the page now renders based on the data we injected.
Yeah.
So I just started the test. It should open a
I know I saw some people in the chat asking about, like, are we doing this with Playwright or not? And yeah, we are doing this particular demo with Playwright, but like you said, you could use other tools, like you use Selenium, or any, whatever your favorite automated browser test tool is. The point here is that you now have an actual Kestrel endpoint that you can point those tools at in order to do automated browser testing with Web Application Factory.
So it started. Here is a page, and if I go to the, oh, it looks like I'm late. Okay, I'll do this again.
10 seconds wasn't enough.
Maybe 10 seconds was too optimistic.
It was distracting
Okay,
you.
it's back. So privacy page, and we see test information now.
Yeah.
Okay, so we see that the page works. So this is great. So let's see what. Let's talk about use case and start server APIs that are new. So in the past, we've seen a lot of customers who tried to do this, to basically force WebApplicationFactory to do the things they needed to enable real server targeting integration tests. Okay, that definitely wasn't the scenario supported by WebApplicationFactory. And what it actually meant is, let's utilize some capabilities of WebApplicationFactory, throw the rest away, and put on top some extra logic to start a real server. That's basically what customers used to do to achieve working with real server. And I'll demonstrate it like with this code. Like this is a sample. I've commented it out here, but this is a code customers would write to start a real server on the side, keep track of it so they can kill it after the test is done, and while it is active, use it in the test. So we're not doing any of it anymore. Okay, and as you can see, our factory class is clean. So back to the privacy test. So instead, we now have this use Kestrel API. What it does is it basically configures the WebApplicationFactory internally and tells no need to use test server at all. Like use a real server based on all the configuration coming from the program CS file of the application we target, the WebApplicationFactory targets. Plus, of course, all the customizations you've made in your own factory implementation, right, through the customized web host method override we saw here. So now that's it. Another problem with WebApplicationFactory before .NET 10 was the lack of a way to actually just start that server without any side effects. So what customers used to do was doing something like, I don't need the result of this, but WebApplicationFactory create client. And this internally would basically bootstrap the WebApplicationFactory in the server. Okay. Unfortunately, the side effect I mentioned is it will also return the HTTP client instance, which again nobody used because you're utilizing the browser and end-to-end automation framework like Selenium or Playwright. So we don't need any of this anymore. We have this use Kestrel mechanism. It will start Kestrel, and the rest is just again the test you would write with Playwright with all its capabilities, and they have a ton of capabilities. Okay, so but let's focus on use Kestrel and other overloads it provides. So what does use Kestrel do? As I said, it configures the WebApplicationFactory to utilize Kestrel internally. Without, it has multiple overloads, as you can see. It has three more specifically. It has use Kestrel with no overloads. It has a specific port overload where you can explicitly specify the port to be used. Like, for example, if I say, let's use port 5555, let's do this 15 seconds to not miss it, and start this again, you can, oh, this is from the old one, sorry.
Not that one.
Nope. Oh, my new one is actually still working, I think. Yeah, see, in my output, you see that the server did start on 555 port, and it is already gone. It's too late. Anyway, but it basically, this just proves that it utilized the port we asked it to, and I can successfully navigate to that 555 port and navigate through the pages. Okay.
Some feedback, Artak. Someone asked about whether it would be better to have an async version of that start server call.
We don't.
Thoughts on that? Like, does it matter? Like, having an async version there, would that be an improvement?
There was a good reason. We did discuss this when we were designing this. There was a good reason to not have an async version for this. I don't remember the exact reason, but it definitely was something that came up too.
Okay, so did get discussed in code review, but
maybe in code review we have that. Is that yeah, exactly.
So go ask Copilot, see if it remembers.
I'm sure if I start looking into the code, I'll remember it, but I'm not sure this is the right time.
And then some positive people happy to see that this was finally added. I know there were like a whole series, like we've had feedback in our backlog for quite a while about being able to support a using Kestrel with WebApplicationFactory. There have been like a series of community blog posts and attempts to try and use the tricks that you were just showing to piece something together that would work. It's nice to see that this is actually making it into the framework in a proper way.
So I think the reason may have also been that if we went that route, it would just break the existing test server based aspect too. Okay, because a lot of code is reused from the existing Web Application Factory implementation, and we tried to keep it as much as possible backward compatible. So not breaking the kind of usual use cases, the old use cases. Anyway, so going back to the overloads, right? Like, while this is possible, one should be very mindful about using a specific port setting in their test, because there are, like, if you have multiple tests, they usually run in parallel, and you may very well run into port conflicts. Okay, so utilizing the non-port requiring the overload without parameters would rely on the dynamic port assignment behavior. Will utilize a dynamic port assignment behavior, and you will not have that problem. But again, there are situations where you need to, and you may very well configure that particular test collection to not run in parallel, and you may have a good reason for utilizing the port specific overload. Another overload, interesting one with use Kestrel, is the one where you can configure the Kestrel server that is being started behind the scenes. And with this overload, you're going to the method is going to accept this action, like basically configuring the Kestrel server option. So you'll say options, and then okay, this is it. Okay, and here options is Kestrel server options basically, and you get access to basically everything you would when configuring Kestrel. Okay, like limits, etc., and you very much can later have specific scenarios validating some aspects of this. So one can think like, hey, how I configure both port and the customizing these options. Well, you can stack these calls up. Like you can very much have both use Kestrel 5000 and or whatever, as well as this call, and both will take effect. Okay.
Nice.
So one use case, for example, to showcase how this is used, let's do that. Let's do 5555. Let's go with options, and what I'll do here 1 second is I'll do options add server header, for example, false. I don't remember whether the true or false was the default, but we'll see that this in a second. So 20 seconds, 20 maybe is not enough, so I'll do 25. Okay. So I'm starting this test now. Once it's started, we'll look at the browser. So starting test.
What's the add server header? Is that the letting you know like what server is
Exactly.
sending the response, like letting you know this is an ASP.NETCore Kestrel server?
Okay, so this is up. And if I go to the browser network tab and go to privacy page, and this call, I look into the response headers. You can see that there is no server header here, right? Like no server header. Response headers only 3 there are: content type, date, and transfer encoding. So now going back to here, test pass, and I'm going to change this to true and start this test again. See, okay, this is back up. Now we can see the server header, server Kestrel is back. Okay, so depending on your scenario, like this is one example how you can impact the underlying server, and maybe your scenario requires validating some of these aspects too.
So that's a good. It's all useful to point out, right? Because like we talked before about how when you're just dealing with integration tests using like HTTP client and like Angle Sharp and trying to deal with the HTML directly, basically trying to play the role of the browser. There's complexities there in trying to like pretend to be a browser. But in this world now, it's worth pointing out that there's additional complexity because you are now involving the network. Like the network is there, ports matter. You talked about avoiding port conflicts, being cognizant of that. You can, like you said, you can randomly assign the ports that are available from the system. But if you're doing a lot of these tests, then you may run into port exhaustion problems where you just run out of ports. So there can be additional flakiness to this style of testing that can be introduced by moving to having the network involved. So that's some of the trade-offs that you're really dealing with here.
Yep. And so this is most of it really. I have 2 examples in my repo showing like this was Razor web page, and we also have a Blazor app here, which is statically rendered, no interactivity, and I chose that only for simplicity. And similar to the other one, I have weather page tests, which we don't need this anymore. This is for the old case. And we again have Blazor WebAppFactory, where I configure test weather service implementation. And I have again similar call to use Kestrel and then start server. And then I have test validating that the proper weather data has been returned. By proper, I mean the one configured to the test project.
Yeah, it's actually it's interesting to think about testing Blazor with this. Like, of course it works with Blazor, like you're showing. But one of the limitations that I think exists with WebApplicationFactory is that it will give you an HTTP client, like so you can send normal, get, post, put, delete type of requests. I don't think it actually today surfaces like opening up a WebSocket connection with the server. Like if you want to test something based off of a WebSocket based functionality. I think Test Server does have that, but WebApplicationFactory doesn't. So if you're talking about like a Blazor server style app where the interactions are actually happening over a WebSocket, with based on SignalR, which honestly is implementation details to you. You don't even necessarily know how to interact with that WebSocket connection. By enabling automated browser testing, you can leverage the fact that the browser knows how to deal with that, can set up the WebSocket, and you're just asking Playwright or whatever to click on buttons and do things, and you can validate that things are happening appropriately.
Exactly. You don't care. The only thing you're interacting in this situation is a browser, and browsers are well known to deal with all types of protocols. So that's an implementation detail you don't care about in these scenarios.
Very cool. I'm just checking to see if there's any other questions here. Here's one. I'm thinking about front-end stuff like JavaScript files, static resources, wiring those to in the regular server setup is a pain with bundling and modification things. How is that stuff here in this kind of app? And I think this is a great point because this is kind of one of the differences between like using test server directly or using Web Application Factory. Like Web Application Factory will actually correctly set up the content route for the app that you're testing, which is what all the static file stuff is based off of, right? Like that special www root folder that you use to put all your JavaScript files and things in. That all needs to be found in the right place, and Web Application Factory actually knows how to do that. When you then introduce a browser, like with Playwright, like you're doing here, then those files would get downloaded as part of the whatever the browser is loading for a given page. So you could do additional verification to make sure that those things are happening correctly, like whatever that JavaScript is doing, like checking that it's having the desired result, or
right.
CSS files and so forth.
And that kind of setting up the content root path is not a very simple code to write on your own. It was useful enough for people before, like asking us to abstract that particular chunk of code from Web Application Factory into some other utility so they could utilize it separately. But in a scenario where they want to use it with a real server, and now with Kestrel like integration, you have it basically.
Like you got a reminder on your screen there, Artak.
Oh,
yeah. I think it's also worth pointing out, like they mentioned specifically bundling and minification here. And often those are things that you might only do like when you publish the app. One limitation with this style of integration testing that we're showing you using Web Application Factory is that you're typically not testing against the published app, right? You're not taking the Blazor app or the Razor Pages app, publishing it, get it running on some place, and then somehow attaching Web Application Factory to that. You're kind of using Web Application Factory to start that app up in process. So things that you rely on to happen in like production after the app has been published, and maybe that might be your bundling and minification pipeline. Those may not actually happen in this style of test, so you'll need to use a different approach. This won't deal with those types of concerns. Worth keeping in mind.
I also believe that the Web Application Factory internally sets the environment to development explicitly. So another thing to keep in mind, like in case you have some environment-specific configuration in your program CS, setting up some DI services, etc. Just know that development environment is what will be targeted in this test.
Hakan was asking about the use Kestrel method. Will spin up a real Kestrel server to be tested instead of the in-memory server, and yeah, that's correct. Like this is showing actually opening up a port and doing using a real Kestrel server so that you can enable things like automated browser testing.
Right. Just one tiny clarification there, and most probably you already figured this out, but use Kestrel or use Kestrel some other overload of it are just configuration methods. The start server is the one which ends up starting the underlying server.
Cool. And then RPS was asking, like, so is this only for static server-side rendering with Blazor? And the answer is no, because like this is using automated browser testing. So the nice thing about this approach is that all the render modes should now apply. If you're like pointing the browser at the app and it downloads the WebAssembly, .NET WebAssembly runtime, does everything client-side, that will just work because you're now testing against using like something like Playwright to test against whatever is happening in the browser. So it's actually an improvement over if you tried to do everything in memory, like using the old test server approach. In that world, yeah, you do issue an HTTP request, and then suddenly you're potentially downloading a HTML file that has all the links to the Blazor scripts, and you'd have to deal with all that yourself, which would be probably not.
You have to write a browser yourself. That's what you want to see. And so that question is valid. I mentioned earlier that I chose to go with Blazor SSR project here just for the sake of simplicity, to keep other things which are somewhat unrelated to this out of the picture. And yes, Dan is right. You can absolutely use any flavor of Blazor hosting and it will work.
So I guess one question then is when do people get to play around with this, Artak? Like when
I
is this
believe
coming? Is it
this
already in the
will
.NET 10 releases, or is it?
I believe this is in preview 4. So as soon as preview 4 ships, you will be able to utilize this API from the packages that Dan mentioned earlier, Microsoft ASP.NET Core MVC testing. Yeah.
Awesome. So preview 4 should be coming soon. That's this month's release. It's a May release. I believe it's supposed to go out, hopefully, knock on wood, fingers crossed, next week.
Yep.
So to be looking for that. If you are eager and can't wait for the actual official preview release, there are, of course, always regular builds of what we're working on in .NET 10 that you can find on the .NET SDK repo. So you can give those a try. Just be aware that they're not necessarily even coherent builds yet, so your mileage may vary. You may hit all interesting issues with those builds. But the official preview 4 release is coming soon. Days, maybe a week or two, and this will be available in that release for you to try out. Awesome. Okay. Yeah. Artak, that was great. Thank you so much for coming on the show today. I think that's what we've got to show you folks. If you have any questions that we didn't get to live on the stream, please feel free, of course, to post them in the comment section on the videos, and we'll try to get to them. Or you can always find us on GitHub on the .NET ASP.NETCore repo. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
All right. Let me see if I can figure out how to do the video. There we go. All right, here we go.